I don't usually make videos expressing my political opinions on this channel. Most mappers generally don't. But I do think this topic is pretty important to discuss because of how bad things are getting. I'm not really good with intros, so I think I'll just start. Starting in September, President Donald Trump began a campaign of maximum pressure on Venezuela, mainly in pursuit of getting the Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro out of office. Before I continue, I'd like to say that this video is not meant to be a defense of the horrible and disgusting Maduro regime. Maduro has been a terrible leader, an authoritarian socialist whose administration regularly killed protesters and also led the country to economic ruin. Venezuela faced what was essentially the largest refugee crisis in the Americas in the 21st century, with millions fleeing the country and spreading out across the continent. Trump now is seemingly toying with the idea to use military force and deploy boots on the ground to get this guy out of power, though. And I really do think that there are so many issues with that entire plan. First of all, do we not remember Iraq? Iraq was one of the worst things that the U.S. ever got involved with. The only people that it somewhat benefited were like the oil companies. Everybody else suffered. We spent so much money. We spent billions of dollars trying to build up the Iraqi democracy. We lost so many people. We lost thousands of brave young men and women in Iraq. It was a terrible, terrible thing. And now Donald Trump wants to essentially do it again with Venezuela, because keep in mind, these are very similar instances, all down to the mustaches of the dictators. It's two countries that are opposing the United States, and if military action is taken, the U.S. is going to steamroll Venezuela just like it steamrolled Iraq. Now, taking over the country initially has never been the issue for the United States. The U.S. Army is, in my opinion, the most competent fighting force on the planet. The issue here is actually staying and building up the country. You see, with Iraq, there was so much political and economic instability after we essentially rolled over Saddam. And the same thing is probably going to be true for Venezuela if we do it. Additionally, a new migrant crisis could easily take place, with millions more Venezuelans fleeing the country as it becomes even more destabilized than it already is. We also run the risk of drug cartels and other criminal groups becoming larger, becoming more powerful, and taking over areas of the country that the United States is far less able to control, mainly jungles. Remember, the U.S. military, as strong as it is, doesn't do very well against guerrilla warfare. We lost in Vietnam to the guerrilla warfare. We lost in Afghanistan to guerrilla warfare. And there's no saying that the U.S. Army has prepped itself enough to fight another guerrilla war inside Venezuela. Now, I know in mapping series, this would definitely go over swimmingly. The U.S. would just quickly invade, add some war slides, and Venezuela gets a new government. Whoop-de-doo. That's extremely easy. We all know this isn't how it is in real life. Once again, to all the people who are still, pro-war because it seems cool or whatever, war is not something that has a respawn anchor and a little Dark Age edit playing in the background. No, war is extremely gritty. It is extremely terrible. It has a terrible mental effect on basically everybody that partakes in it. And that's what we're toying with here. Listen, Donald Trump says that he is the president of peace, and yet he is essentially going after and starting a new military conflict, this time in our own backyard. This is not a peaceful resolution to any kind of problem. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that Maduro will be deposed peacefully. However, what does the United States even have to gain from this? At least most American people, what do they have to gain from this? Because from what I'm seeing, all we will gain is higher taxes or more military spending, which will in turn lead to inflation because, the government has to print more money to keep things going. And we're going to get thousands of dead Americans. The American corpses, they'll come back to the United States and be put in a graveyard somewhere. That's the only thing that I'm seeing we can really get from Venezuela. This is not America first. It's not America first at all to go after a random South American country like this. And additionally, it hurts our credibility on the world stage. Remember, Iraq hit our credibility really, really badly because the Soviet Union had just collapsed. This was like the first time where there was a unipolar American order. And with that power, America decides to roll over the fourth most powerful military on the planet. And that seriously hurt our reputation across the world because it vindicated a lot of Easterners into thinking, oh, look, we need a multipolar world, not an American-led unipolar world, because if the Americans have their way, they're going to destroy everybody and destroy everything because they're quote-unquote imperialist. Now, I'm going to go over some of the justifications the Trump administration has used to, justify the way they're dealing with Venezuela. And the first and most important reason that I think the Trump administration has really, talked about is quote-unquote narco-terrorism. So if you didn't know, the Trump administration has begun blowing up boats in the Caribbean Sea. These boats are generally owned by, Venezuelan fishermen or, according to the Trump administration, drug smugglers or human traffickers. Now, we don't actually know for certain whether or not these people were carrying drugs, mainly because of the fact that the Trump administration straight up just blows them up before, having a trial or anything. But that's besides the point. Donald Trump believes that Nicolas Maduro and his government work with the drug cartels and are thus complicit in the poisoning of the United States. Now, as of December 17th, he has also declared the Maduro government as a terrorist organization. By the time I upload this, I'm not sure if that might be changed. Maybe there will be another classification, or maybe he'll rescind that. But for now, that's how it is. Additionally, he just generally seems to believe that all of these groups are working together to hurt the United States. And that's where things like the blockade on oil tankers comes from. It's from the idea that the Venezuelan government is committing asymmetric warfare against the United States. Now, the issue with the Trump administration using this justification is the fact that they evidently do not care very much about, drug trafficking. What is my proof of this? Well, just a few weeks ago, Donald Trump pardoned a former Honduran president. Now, the reason why this is significant is because this former Honduran president was convicted over drug smuggling and weapons trafficking charges. Just think about that for a second. He's going after Venezuela for alleged drug trafficking and weapons trafficking, and he pardoned somebody who was convicted of that regardless. That doesn't make much sense. And I think it does go to show that Donald Trump doesn't necessarily care about, the drug problem as the main issue. So if that's not the main justification, what is? A reasoning that has been given by the Trump administration, which is divorced from the entire, narco-terrorism idea, is the fact that apparently Venezuela stole from U.S. firms, U.S. oil companies, when nationalizing their oil industry. Now, whether or not this is true is up for debate, and that's just a bigger argument about nationalization, what the United States, its role is on the world stage when it comes to nationalization. But that's not really the point here. The point is Venezuela, some time ago, they nationalized their oil fields, and this was back before even Obama was president, I'm pretty sure. It was a long time ago. But now Donald Trump is saying, we need to take it back. We need to take these fields back because they were American owned. The issue with this is pretty simple, and it's that if that was such a big problem, it should have been dealt with some time ago, back when it actually happened. Donald Trump coming in decades after the fact and saying, oh, I'm going to come in and I'm going to, fix this, that just seems kind of silly. You know what I mean? That doesn't really seem like something that holds up a lot of water. And to be quite frank, if the United States really wanted to deal with that, should have done it back then. Additionally, it also plays into this kind of idea that America is fighting this for oil. And the issue with that, it's literally the same thing as Iraq. A lot of people think that Iraq, it was fought because of the oil. So it was young American men and women. They were never, ever going to see the level of wealth that these like gigantic oil tycoons have, they died for these oil tycoons so they could get even richer. That is really bad PR, not just for the Trump administration, but for the United States as a whole. That goes back to the idea of destroying American credibility, because it looks like the United States can just go anywhere they want, take over the oil fields, and, have their oil tycoons make a handsome profit. I think that's ridiculous, and I think that the economic argument for this is actually worse than the narco-terrorism argument, because at least Donald Trump has like something to say when it comes to the quote-unquote narco-terrorism stuff, because he has actually taken some, restrictive measures when it comes to things like the southern border. This is just a stupid idea. This is legitimately ridiculous. And I can't believe that the Trump administration thinks that a justification like this would ever go well with the American people, especially after Iraq. A final reason that I personally subscribe to, I think this might be the main reason why Trump is actually going for this, is the Monroe Doctrine. If you didn't know, Venezuela is very good friends with Russia and China. Now, I am not a big fan of the Russian or Chinese governments. I think both of them are disgusting autocracies, and both of them are responsible for multiple genocides in their history. Absolutely terrible governments, and we should not be friendly to them at all. However, a lot of countries work with these governments. Now, the Monroe Doctrine, which is, America's like foreign policy for some time, which was established under the President James Monroe, was this idea that the Americas, North America and South America, were the domain of the United States, right? That is our sphere of influence. I think Donald Trump is seeing the growing multipolarity on the world stage, and while he does want to be somewhat isolationist, he still believes that the Americas should still be, the United States' domain. Now, whether or not this is a viable foreign policy strategy is one thing, but to essentially go into countries that are working with, foreigners like the Russians and the Chinese and obliterate them, because if we did, go into Venezuela, we would essentially obliterate their government, that's a really bad look, especially for other countries that currently work with Russia and China. For example, Brazil. Brazil is the giant of South America. It is a growing industrial powerhouse and probably going to be one of the great powers of the world in the next few decades. What are they going to think if we go into a country that was working with Russia and China, and that is like one of the underlying causes, that because they were working with Russia and China, we went in and we completely destroyed them? That is not going to look good on our part, and I think if we do want to maintain some kind of like Monroe Doctrine kind of system where we're isolationist, but we still hold power inside the Americas, that's not the way to go at all. And, there is a debate to be had there, and the Trump administration certainly hasn't used that argument as much as the economic argument or the narco-terrorism argument. But I think that a lot of foreign policy analysts can look at this and say, that seems to be something that the Trump administration is using, Monroe Doctrine. And, I think that can seriously worry a lot of countries across the world. Now, once again, I'd just like to say, this is not some kind of advertisement or saying, the Russian government and Chinese government, it's completely okay if democracies or other countries, work with them. I don't think that's okay at all. I think these governments should be ideally politically and economically isolated. But that's not the world we live in. And both of these countries have been able to thrive despite all of the human rights abuses they've committed. So we have to be pragmatic about this stuff, and not being pragmatic, deciding to be, fully rigid, that's going to make countries like the United States and just the collective West in general, that's going to make us lose this Cold War we currently have with China. And I just don't think it's a very good strategy. All in all, I really do feel like an American intervention in Venezuela or regime change in Venezuela or a straight up boots on the ground invasion of Venezuela, it's a terrible idea. I think if that did happen, we could see another kind of Iraq situation where thousands of Americans are forced to give their lives up. That's going to be thousands of families hurt for decades to come for essentially nothing. America or Americans in general really don't gain much from a conflict in Venezuela. I don't think this puts America first. I think actually it only keeps the interests of a few certain people first. But the country in general, I think, will suffer from this. I think our debt is going to increase if we are forced to pay for, an occupation of Venezuela. And we would have to build democratic institutions in Venezuela essentially from scratch because Maduro has completely destroyed them. And I don't think it's worth it for the United States to do that at this time. With all of this in mind, I thank you guys for watching if you've reached to the end. And I don't think I'm going to be making many more political videos like this. However, I just thought that this is a really important topic to me, especially because, I don't want to see Americans deployed and get killed in Venezuela. I think that's something we should avoid in general. But yeah, thank you for watching and have a good day.